Cheers, guys. What are you doing while watching? Just relaxing or multitasking? Let me know.
My parents were always broke. At least that's what they said every single time I needed something. Not even extravagant things. Basic stuff, like the $50 for my yearbook, the 25 for an AP exam, or gas money when my friend's dad couldn't give us a ride to SAT prep. Every time I asked, it was like I'd committed some unforgivable offense, like I was asking them to sell a kidney for my education. My mom would rub her temples and mutter about how we weren't like those other families. And my dad would look at the floor, pretending he was deep in thought, even though everyone knew he was just waiting for her to finish so he wouldn't have to say no himself. I stopped asking after a while. It was easier to stay invisible. I got really good at pretending I didn't want anything, especially the one thing I wanted more than anything else: to go to college. Not even a fancy college, just somewhere that wasn't our faded town with its dusty main street, its broken sidewalks, and its futureless comfort. I thought if I played it smart and quiet, I might earn my way out. But even when I started getting letters from schools, real letters with real scholarships attached, my parents barely reacted. My mom said, "That's nice, honey," and kept scrolling on her phone like I just told her the weather report. My dad said, "We'll see," which was his way of saying, "Don't get your hopes up." And I didn't. Not until the day everything changed. I remember it like it happened in slow motion. I had just come home from a shift at the library, and I still had my name tag pinned to my shirt. I was balancing my backpack, a half-empty water bottle, and a packet of financial aid papers I'd picked up from school. I wasn't even in the house yet when I saw it, sitting in the driveway, gleaming under the afternoon sun like something from a commercial. A brand new Ford F-150, jet black, spotless, with that absurdly oversized red bow on the hood. I froze. At first, I honestly thought maybe it was for someone else, like maybe a neighbor parked wrong or maybe a dealership mix-up. But then I saw the license plate, temporary tags, and then I saw Mitch. He came bouncing out of the garage like a game show contestant, arms wide open, eyes bugged out with excitement. "Can you believe it?" he shouted. Not at me specifically, just into the world. "It's mine. They said it's to help me start the landscaping business." I just stood there, packet of papers clutched in one hand, keys dangling from the other, trying to keep my face neutral, while my brain went completely silent. My mom was behind him, beaming like she'd just given birth again. My dad was leaning on the doorframe, grinning like a proud coach after the big game. No one looked at me, no one asked where I'd been, and no one, not a single word, had ever been said about us not having money when this plan was being cooked up. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I said I had homework, which wasn't a lie, but I couldn't have eaten even if I'd tried. My stomach was in knots, and my mind was spinning, stuck between rage and confusion. I pulled out the scholarship letter again, the one I had received just a week earlier, offering me a full ride to a university 3 hours away. It had felt like a golden ticket when it arrived, like my way out, but now it just looked like paper. Worthless paper in a house where value was only measured by who made the most noise or needed rescuing the most often. Mitch hadn't even graduated yet, hadn't held a job longer than 2 months, and couldn't even mow our lawn without being reminded. But somehow, my parents saw potential in him. They saw a future worth investing in. And me? I was just a quiet, responsible girl who didn't cause trouble. That was my fatal flaw, I guess. I didn't need saving. I did my own homework. I packed my own lunches. I applied for scholarships by myself, filled out FAFSA forms in the school library, even called the admissions office to ask about dorms. I was low maintenance, and in this house, low maintenance meant low priority. I waited until midnight. Everyone was asleep. I sat in bed with my laptop, staring at the acceptance email for the 10th time that night. My heart was pounding like I was about to do something illegal. Maybe I was, in their eyes. I clicked accept. The screen refreshed. "Congratulations," it said. That was it. No applause, no champagne, no parents cheering from the doorway. Just silence and the soft hum of my cheap old laptop. The next morning, I walked downstairs with a fake smile, sat through breakfast like nothing had changed, nodded as my mom talked about how Mitch might need help learning to drive stick. I just smiled and offered to take the trash out. Because they didn't know it yet, but I had already started to leave them, quietly, slowly, and this time, I wasn't going to ask for permission. They bought my brother a truck to help him start a future. I was about to build mine without them, and they wouldn't even see it coming. There's something surreal about packing your entire life into 2 beat-up suitcases while the rest of your family sleeps soundly down the hall, completely unaware that when the sun comes up, you won't be there. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. Fear, maybe, or guilt, so thick it would keep me frozen, but the truth was I felt calm. Not peaceful exactly, but focused, like someone stepping onto a moving train, knowing full well they wouldn't be coming back. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just zipped up the last bag, double-checked the email from the scholarship coordinator about my dorm check-in, and waited for the clock to hit midnight like it was the starting gun for a race I'd been training for my entire life. I had already done the hard parts, emailed the admissions office, arranged a dorm assignment, and scheduled a meeting with the financial aid office to confirm everything was squared away. I had even called the housing department from the school bathroom during lunch one day, whispering into the phone so no one would overhear me talking about things my family still didn't know. Ellie, my new roommate, had texted me earlier that evening, letting me know she'd be arriving the next morning and that she was bringing extra sheets just in case, which felt like the kind of kindness I hadn't experienced in a long time. It made me feel like maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe there was actually a place waiting for me, one that didn't come with side glances, second guesses, or the constant feeling that I was just extra. I had taken the small graduation cash I'd gotten from a few teachers and neighbors and used it to reserve a rideshare van that was scheduled to pick me up just past midnight. It was a cheap, slow option, shared with 2 other people heading vaguely in the same direction, but I didn't care. I didn't need fast or fancy. I needed distance. And this was the first time in my life I was willing to wait for it. Every second that passed after midnight was 1 second closer to not having to tiptoe around the living room, 1 second closer to not hearing Mitch complain about how hard it is to be a young entrepreneur, while our mother made him breakfast and reminded him that everyone has a learning curve. As I rolled my luggage down the hallway, careful to avoid the one board that creaked by the bathroom, I took one last glance at the family photos hanging on the walls. It was funny, really, how many of those photos were just the 3 of them. My mom, my dad, and Mitch, smiling at some barbecue or posing at a minor league baseball game I hadn't even been invited to. I used to think maybe they just forgot to include me, but now I knew better. I had become background noise a long time ago. Unintentionally, maybe, but indifference hurts just as much as cruelty. When you're on the receiving end of it for long enough. I left a note on the kitchen table, not a dramatic one. No emotional monologue or scathing accusations, just a few lines scribbled in my most polite handwriting. I've accepted the scholarship and left for school. I'm safe. I'll reach out when I'm settled. Rachel. I didn't sign it with love. Not because I didn't feel it somewhere in the deep, confusing layers of my heart, but because love, in our house, always felt like a transaction, something you owed in exchange for obedience, gratitude, or silence. I didn't owe them anymore. The van arrived 5 minutes early, the driver a quiet woman with heavy eyelids and a lukewarm coffee in the cup holder. She helped me load my bags into the trunk without saying much, and once we pulled away from the curb, I allowed myself one last look at the house. The porch light was still on. My dad always left it that way, just in case, though he never said in case of what. As we rounded the corner, the house disappeared, and I exhaled so slowly it felt like I'd been holding my breath for 18 years. The ride was long and quiet, the kind that lets your thoughts get loud whether you want them to or not. I stared out the window, watching towns blur into each other, each one a little more unfamiliar than the last, and thought about how bizarre it was that my parents would likely wake up in a few hours and just go about their day, completely unaware that their daughter, the one who never asked for much, the one who did everything by the book, had left without asking for a ride, or a goodbye, or even permission. I pictured my mom walking into the kitchen, seeing the note, maybe gasping a little too dramatically for my dad's benefit. I imagined the confusion, the slight sting of betrayal she'd quickly convert into righteous indignation. "After everything we've done for her," she'd say, probably within the first 10 minutes. And I didn't care. That's what surprised me the most. I didn't feel guilt or sadness or fear of burning bridges. I just felt done waiting for their approval, done fighting for crumbs of attention, done pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me every single day. I had given them a chance to see me, to believe in me, to care about the things I cared about, and they chose a truck. They chose a dream that wasn't even theirs to carry. They poured thousands into a boy who couldn't remember to put the milk back in the fridge. And when I got a full ride to college, they treated it like I had asked to go on a luxury vacation. When we finally pulled up in front of the dorm building, the sky had started to shift into that hazy pre-dawn glow, casting everything in soft blue light. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath of air that didn't feel borrowed. I was exhausted, anxious, and completely unsure of what came next. But I was also free. I checked my phone and saw 1 missed call and 3 messages, all from my mom. The last one read, "Are you seriously doing this to us?" I stared at the screen, smiled to myself, and turned it off without replying. Because yes, I was seriously doing this. To them. For me. There's something unsettling about how quickly silence becomes normal, how the absence of familiar voices, even ones you've grown to resent, can settle into your daily life like furniture you never really picked but got used to walking around. In the beginning, I told myself I'd call them eventually, maybe once I was settled, once I felt like I belonged in this new world that smelled like cafeteria pizza, laundry detergent, and last-minute panic. But the days kept passing, then weeks, then entire semesters, and I never once reached for the phone. What started as distance turned into a kind of quiet that I realized I desperately needed, the kind that didn't demand explanations or pretend that love alone could fix everything. Ellie, my roommate, became the first person in years who saw me, not as the quiet girl or the responsible one, but just as someone with thoughts and opinions and real feelings that didn't have to be minimized for the sake of someone else's comfort. She was loud, chaotic in a way I initially found exhausting, but she was honest, and more than that, she was endlessly curious about the world. She asked me questions no one ever had, about books I liked, why I always hesitated before offering my opinion, whether I actually believed the things I'd been told about how life works back home. Living with her was like opening a window in a room that had been stuffy for far too long. Academically, I poured myself into everything. I wasn't the smartest person in every class, but I was definitely the most stubborn. I sat in the front row, took notes until my wrist ached, and treated every professor's office hours like a one-on-one coaching session. I didn't know what the end goal was yet, not really, but I knew that if I was going to build something from scratch, it was going to be solid. Professor Lang, one of the most intimidating instructors in the English department, once told me I had a kind of quiet rage that makes for great writing. I didn't even know I had that in me until he said it out loud. After that, I wrote more, not just essays, but pieces of myself that I'd never dared put on paper before. Some of it was angry, most of it was honest. All of it helped me keep going. My parents, meanwhile, remained background noise. There were no phone calls, no texts beyond the occasional passive-aggressive message from my mother that sounded more like guilt than concern. Things like, "We thought you'd come home for Thanksgiving," or "Mitch is having a hard time. It would mean a lot if you reached out." Not once did they ask how I was doing. Not once did they acknowledge that I had left, not just physically, but emotionally, and that I wasn't planning to come back. Around the middle of sophomore year, Ellie found my note from the kitchen drawer. Yes, I had brought it with me, like some strange little souvenir, and she read it without asking, which should have annoyed me, but somehow didn't. She looked at me afterward and said, "This is the kind of thing people write books about." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged what had happened as something bigger than a family disagreement. It was betrayal. It was abandonment dressed up as, we did what we thought was best. And for the first time, I wasn't the only one who saw it that way. Junior year, I finally heard what happened to Mitch and his truck. It came through the grapevine. Someone from my hometown ended up at the same college, and word got around faster than I expected. Apparently, the landscaping business never took off. He crashed the truck 6 months in, drunk driving, though that part never made it to Facebook. My parents paid out of pocket to fix it the first time, but the second time, insurance wouldn't cover it, and the truck was totaled. He dropped out of community college, tried working at a mechanic's shop for a while, then at a vape store, then nowhere. I didn't take pleasure in his failure, but I won't lie. I didn't feel bad either. He got a launch pad I never had, and he burned it to the ground before he even knew how to use it. And my parents? They circled the wagons, told everyone he was just finding his path, like he hadn't been given a brand new truck and a blank check to write his own future. Senior year, I got the email about graduation. It felt surreal, like someone had added a finish line to a race I hadn't realized I'd been running at full sprint. I forwarded it to Ellie, who immediately sent back 10 exclamation points and a message about which dress she was wearing. I never even considered sending it to my parents. Why would I? They hadn't been there for the beginning. They didn't ask about the in-between. What right did they have to show up for the ending? Still, part of me hesitated. I stared at the RSVP link for hours, wondering if not inviting them made me cruel. But then I thought about the empty chairs at every award ceremony, the unanswered emails I sent with my financial aid confirmations, the time my mother said, "I don't see why you need to leave to be happy," as if my joy was somehow a betrayal. No, they didn't get to come. Not because I hated them, but because they had already chosen their absence. All I was doing was honoring their decision, so I replied with 2 names, Ellie and Professor Lang, the 2 people who had shown up, the 2 people who saw me not as a disappointment or a duty, but as someone worth cheering for. When the confirmation came through, I felt nothing, not joy, not pain, just a sense of finality, like a book closing after the last sentence has been read. I was finally ready to walk across that stage. Whether they were there to see it or not didn't matter anymore. At least that's what I thought. Until the morning of the ceremony, when I looked out the window and saw them, standing outside, talking to security, faces full of panic, and not a single ticket in hand. The sun hadn't fully crested over the horizon when I pulled the graduation robe from the plastic wrapping, letting the folds settle across the back of the rickety wooden chair in my dorm room. The same chair I'd sat in 1,000 times to write essays, apply for internships, or just zone out with headphones while trying to drown out the creeping thought that maybe, even now, I wasn't truly free of them. The air smelled like coffee grounds and old paperbacks, and there was a strange stillness to the morning, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. Ellie had already gone ahead to meet up with her parents, leaving a lipstick-smudged coffee cup and a handwritten note on my pillow that said, "You made it. I'm so damn proud of you." I stared at that note for longer than I should have, gripping the edges like it was some kind of anchor, because I knew, deep down, I wasn't going to be able to enjoy this day without a storm chasing it. The auditorium was already buzzing by the time I arrived, filled with the low roar of families finding their seats, professors adjusting their gowns, and students laughing nervously with friends, trying to act like this moment didn't mean more than they could admit. I slipped into line near the back, my name pinned to the inside of my robe, breathing in slowly and counting backward from 20 to keep myself grounded. I had planned for everything, the order of events, where Ellie would sit, when Professor Lang would be on stage, but what I hadn't planned for was what I saw when I glanced toward the far edge of the campus gates, beyond the line of volunteers checking tickets and directing foot traffic. There, just outside the barriers, were 2 familiar figures, unmistakable even from a distance. My mother stood rigid, her purse clutched to her chest like it was a shield, talking with increasing urgency to one of the student ushers. My father hovered a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels in that same passive stance he always used when he was up. out of his depth but unwilling to say so. From where I stood, I couldn't hear their words, but their expressions told me everything. My mom's mouth moved rapidly, sharp and impatient, while my dad offered half smiles that didn't reach his eyes, glancing around as if hoping someone, anyone, would recognize them and swoop in to fix whatever mess they'd walked into. I froze. My heart didn't race. It slowed, like the moment before impact in a car accident, when all you can do is wait for the crunch. They had come. Without a ticket, without an invitation, without a single text or phone call in the weeks leading up to today, they had decided, somehow, that this was their moment too, that they belonged here, that after 4 years of absence and silence, of missed birthdays and cold holidays, of willful neglect and misplaced loyalty to a son who couldn't hold a job or tell the truth, they could just show up and be part of the final scene. I turned away quickly, praying no one had seen me recognize them, willing my breath to steady as I stared at the back of the girl in front of me, who was nervously adjusting her cap and talking to someone on speakerphone about where to go for dinner afterward. I knew how this would go. They would tell the staff they were the parents of a graduate. They had simply forgotten to RSVP. It must have been a mix-up, and surely there was room. Surely someone could make an exception. And maybe someone would believe them. My mother was nothing if not persuasive, especially when she felt wronged. She'd probably throw in some story about how I hadn't told them the details, how I'd been distant lately, how they'd driven all the way here just to surprise me. That was her specialty, twisting facts until they were just blurry enough to look like misunderstandings. I could imagine her now, voice trembling just enough to evoke pity, hand resting gently on the volunteer's forearm, as if to say, "You understand, don't you?" And I hated how well I knew the script. A part of me wanted to walk away, to disappear into the crowd, to let them stand there confused and frustrated, until the ceremony ended and the lawn emptied and they were left holding their embarrassment in their hands like wilted flowers. But another part, the one that had carried every unanswered question and buried every unmet need, needed to see it, needed to watch them realize they no longer held a place in this version of my life. So I stepped off the path for just a moment, peering through the hedges from a shaded patch by the side of the auditorium, watching them from behind the safety of distance. My mother was now pacing, phone pressed to her ear, clearly leaving me a voicemail. My father leaned against the gate, looking older than I remembered, his shoulders a little more slouched, his stomach a little fuller, like time had crept up on him, while he was busy pretending everything was fine. I knew that look, resignation, and it struck me how familiar it felt, because I had worn it too once, every time I realized I couldn't expect anything more than what I'd been given. But now the roles had reversed, and I was the one watching them grasp for a version of the story that no longer included them. When the ushers finally, politely, asked them to step back, informing them once again that without credentials they couldn't enter, my mother's posture changed. Her shoulders dropped, her face tightened, and she took a step back, not in defeat, but in calculation. I could almost hear the words forming in her head. "We'll talk about this later. She'll come around. She's just being dramatic." It was always about control. Even when she was losing it, she was rewriting the narrative. I walked back to the line, adjusted my cap, and didn't look back again. When it was my turn to walk across the stage, I didn't search the crowd. I didn't wonder whether they had found a way in or if they were watching from the parking lot. I looked straight ahead, toward Professor Lang, who gave me the smallest, proudest nod. I looked at Ellie, who was clapping like her hands might fall off. I walked forward slowly, purposefully, letting the sound of my name echo off the walls like a declaration. And when I shook the dean's hand and took that diploma cover, all I could think was, they missed it. They missed all of it. Not because they couldn't be there, but because they had chosen not to show up when it mattered. And now, when it no longer did, they were locked outside, pleading with strangers to let them back into a life they had willingly walked out of. But that door had closed 4 years ago. I just hadn't turned the key until now. I never imagined that the last thing I'd ever say to my parents, at least in the form of something personal, something they couldn't interrupt or twist into something else, would be left behind like a package no one asked for, slid into their mailbox on a humid summer morning without warning or fanfare. No knock on the door, no signature required, just me, a parked rental car at the edge of the street, engine running, fingers shaking slightly as I pulled the envelope from the passenger seat and stepped out like I was crossing into enemy territory. The air smelled like cut grass and pavement dust, and it took everything in me not to glance at the windows of the house I once called home, because I didn't need to see the curtains twitch or the faint movement of someone half expecting a confrontation. I wasn't there to be seen or heard. I was there to be understood finally, if they had the nerve to read past the first paragraph. Writing the letter had been harder than I expected, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what needed to be said. And there's a kind of weight that comes with choosing the final words you'll give to someone who always made you feel like you were asking for too much, even when all you wanted was to matter. I had rewritten the beginning 5 times before settling on the version that felt most honest. Not cruel, not bitter, not angry for the sake of theatrics. Just honest in a way I had never been allowed to be growing up. It started like this. This isn't a goodbye letter because you said goodbye to me a long time ago. You just never noticed. I wrote about the day I got my scholarship letter and how I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at it like a lifeline that I wasn't sure I deserved, while downstairs my brother was explaining how he needed a bigger mower for his imaginary landscaping business, and my mother was nodding along like he was reciting scripture. I reminded them, gently but clearly, of the truck, the bow, the celebration, the way I stood there holding my future in one hand, while they handed my brother a shortcut he hadn't earned. I didn't blame them for loving him. I didn't even blame them for choosing him. I blame them for never once pausing to see the cost of that choice, for assuming I would be fine without support, without encouragement, without even basic acknowledgement, because I didn't complain or cause scenes. I told them that being the quiet child was not the same as being the content one, that following rules and doing chores and keeping my head down wasn't a sign of peace. It was survival. I needed them to understand that every smile I forced, every "it's okay" I gave them, every time I swallowed the lump in my throat and said I understand when they let me down, was just another brick in the wall that eventually became the barrier between us. I told them that when I left that night at midnight, bags in hand and hope barely hanging on, it wasn't out of defiance. It was out of necessity, because staying would have meant surrendering to a version of myself that only existed to make them comfortable. I wrote about college, not the grades or the achievements, but the people who saw me, who listened without expectation or obligation, who celebrated my existence without needing me to prove I was worth the effort. I told them about Ellie, who left sticky notes on my laptop before exams and screamed my name across the quad when I made the dean's list. I told them about Professor Lang, who once looked me in the eye and said, "You're not just smart, you're important," and how that single sentence did more for my sense of self than 18 years of dutiful daughterhood ever did. I told them that, for the first time, I felt like I belonged to something that wasn't built on obligation or disappointment. I ended the letter with something that surprised even me. Not a threat, not a plea, but a wish. I wished them peace. I wished them the clarity to see the things they never looked at long enough to understand. I wished them the courage to face the silence I left behind and ask themselves why it felt so loud. And then in the final line I wrote, "You may still be waiting for me to come home, but I already did. I found it somewhere else." I folded the letter carefully, sealed the envelope, and wrote nothing on the front except their last name, as if to remind them that this message wasn't about warmth or familiarity. It was about truth. I slid it into the mailbox slowly, almost reverently, as if placing a time capsule into the ground, unsure of whether it would ever be opened, but knowing that it no longer mattered if it was. It was out of me now, that weight, that longing, that need to explain. I had carried it for too long, and leaving it behind didn't feel like a release as much as it felt like finally setting the record straight with the only people who ever refused to read past the surface. I got back in the car, kept the windows rolled up, and didn't start the engine right away. I sat there in silence, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the mailbox from the corner of my eye, like it might somehow spit the letter back out. But it didn't. It stayed there, tucked between coupon flyers and utility bills. Just another envelope waiting to be read. As I pulled away, I didn't look back. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew now that my story didn't need their validation to matter. Maybe they'd read it that night. Maybe they'd let it sit for days, afraid of what it might say. Or maybe they'd throw it away without opening it, pretending once again that silence is softer than truth. I'll never know. And for the first time in my life, I don't need to. Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger or cruelty or some grand gesture that leaves everyone talking. Sometimes the best revenge is living a life so far removed from the one they tried to confine you to, that when they finally look up and realize you're gone, it's not with fury, but with the quiet, crushing knowledge that they were never invited to where you were going. Not because you hate them, but because you finally learned to love yourself more.